Hi, my name is Fred Sklar, and welcome to a discussion of Everglades ecological history. I am director of the Everglades Research Section of the South Florida Water Management District. I have a background in landscape ecology with application in Louisiana and South Carolina before I came to the South Florida Water Management District in 1993. Today I'm going to talk to you about this ecological history in two phases. The first phase will look at the temporal sequence of infrastructure changes and its consequences. And the second phase will look more at the spatial characteristics of the changes that occurred, starting with the most northern part of the Greater Everglades, the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge, and working our way down all the way to Florida Bay. So the Greater Everglades then and now, it's definitely a significant change. Obviously, you can see from the image on the left that the Everglades had a giant sawgrass plains, which tended to act like a sieve and create the sheet flow that went into the Ridge and Slough system, which eventually went into Shark Slough and Taylor Slough in Florida Bay. And along the edge of Lake Okeechobee, there would be a very thick forest of pond apple. And now, of course, that pond apple is gone. The sawgrass plain has been replaced by the Everglades agricultural area. We have approximately 3 million people living along the East Coast, and the system has been compartmentalized. The chronology of how we got from the pre-drainage to our current system is what I want to talk about first. From 1900 to 1930, we had the drainage period. Then from the next period we call the flood control period. We went to the water conservation period, and then we had to deal with phosphorus and managing phosphorus. We call that the water quality control period. And then we are currently in the hydrologic restoration period. The drainage period had four major canals: the North New River, the Hillsborough, the Miami, and the West Palm Beach, canal, which is shown here on this image as the C51. These four canals going from Lake Okeechobee through the Everglades and ending up near the coastal habitats is capable of draining 3 times the annual rainfall. And so they were very effective in starting the process of bringing the water levels down, and as a result, causing the fire and soil oxidation, which I'll talk about in a minute. I do want to bring up the fact that there was also the construction in 1928 of the Tamiami Trail Road, which acted like a dam and was put in to not only get across from east to west and west to east, but also to drain this system for agriculture and development. And of course, this rich organic soil known as black gold brought a lot of people to Florida, and by 1920, human communities were getting well established and installing their own drainage systems, like this image here on the right, trying to build their own canals which would connect to the bigger canals so that we could have development. The black gold rush created significant peat fires, soil oxidation, and subsidence. And what you see here in this image is 2 to 3 feet of peat that was just burnt away, and indicative of the type of environment that caused below ground peat fires that could burn for weeks at a time and remove organic matter that took 1,000 years to create. By 1928, everything changed, and there was a horrific Okeechobee hurricane, and thousands of people died, and there was a call for flood control. It took some time, but eventually Congress funded the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to build the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control District, which later became the South Florida Water Management District. And it took some time because the engineers had to really think out this massive new levee, canal, and water control structure system. And what you see here that was produced in 1947, 19 years after the Okeechobee hurricane, is a fairly good representation of what we currently have in the system. The first thing that they did after that famous report came out is to build a levee along the eastern boundary of the Everglades, going from West Palm Beach all the way down to Miami-Dade. And what's interesting is that Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, was the most aggressive in trying to push back the Everglades as much as possible and reclaim this fertile land for agriculture and development. The other thing that occurred during one of the first things out of the box with the flood control report was the walling off of the Everglades agricultural area and allowing the system to drain even more. So this reduced sheet flow, and it created a significant wetland spatial, it reduced the wetland spatial extent significantly, but it also did a significant change in soil subsidence, and there was a loss of topography. The combination of drainage and flood control on the tree islands, what happened here is that a lot of the soil oxidized away from the trees. And then in areas like the Everglades agricultural area, we found that the subsidence rate, the oxidation rate, was as much as 6 feet. Now we enter the water conservation period, which was realized because we did such a good job of draining the system and preventing flooding that we took away our drinking supply. And so we had to create this infrastructure, these controls, and significantly impound these areas and create 3 conservation areas, 1, 2, 3, actually more than 3A, 3B. And what we realized that we had to build levees to hold the water in because of this feature, the fact that the below ground limestone was so porous, that seepage was so great that unless we did something dramatic like build this very large L67A levee separating 3A from 3B and preventing water from flowing in the southeasterly direction towards Miami, that we had to keep the water there during the dry season, or else we wouldn't have anything for irrigation or drinking. And we got very good at understanding exactly how to keep the water in the Everglades during the dry season. We put another levee here in the L67. We enhanced the northern part of 3A, and we built the South Dade conveyance system, which might be the most complicated system of all, trying to meet the needs of agriculture, people, drinking, and flood control, and all at the same time. The consequences of this is quite remarkable and significant. The first thing you notice is that we have a loss of microtopography. The flows to Everglades National Park are diverted westward. The park itself is getting drier. The water conservation areas now develop these hydrologic gradients where it's dry at the top of the conservation areas and ponding up at the southern part of the system. Water quality begins to degrade and tree islands drown. And what's interesting about the tree islands is that they're drowning, even though you're bringing the water levels back to what they might have been historically. They're drowning because the flood phase and the drainage phase created a lot of soil oxidation and elevation loss, so that when you brought the water levels up, then now the islands are a lot deeper than they were historically. So the infrastructure is now complete, and we can show you how it all happens within 5 seconds. It took 100 years to do it, but only 5 seconds to show you on this map overlaying the historic Everglades. And you can just see just how complicated it is. And now that the infrastructure is complete, we had to go to these next two phases of trying to mitigate the impacts of this infrastructure. And the first phase is the water quality control phase, where we're trying to manage phosphorus. The image there in the upper right is STA 1 West, one of the first STAs we built to try and remove phosphorus before it goes into the Loxahatchee Refuge. And then the bottom image is the need to reconnect the system, remove some of those barriers to flow, and one of the most significant things in place now is bridging Tamiami Trail, and that's what that is a picture of. Compartmentalization consequence is really seen nicely here in this simulation of a tracer put in at the very top of 3A, and then following how the water pulses through the ecosystem during a wet and dry period, how it hugs the canals, and how it's being pushed to more towards the western part of Everglades National Park. And what you see here is that the water going into 3B, this is all seepage. Water is coming down the Miami Canal and coming down another canal within the system and distributed to a region that did not historically see this level. And so restoration needs to bring it back to the eastern side. And restoration also needs to improve the dry season. If you look at these three graphs, the current flows, the SERP flow that we hope to get, and what we think is the pre-drainage flow across Tamiami Trail into Shark Slough, you see significant differences, not only just in the quantity of water, but also the timing of the water that we are trying to get. And SERP will be focused mostly on the dry period, trying to prevent that soil oxidation, the change in microtopography, and I'll go more into some of the ecological consequences of this infrastructure in a minute. But if we step back and we look at the landscape scale consequences of this central and southern Florida flood control district and compare the image on the left to the image on the right, the first thing you see, of course, is the extent of the Everglades is significant, but also the peat depths throughout the system is also significantly less on the image on the right. And the numbers on each side of this figure are quite remarkable as well. You're looking at average peat depths historically of 2 meters, but now we're at 0.75. We see that the peat volume is significantly reduced. And what's actually interesting is that the 900 million cubic tons of carbon that existed in this system has now been reduced by 77%. So the Everglades, at a large landscape scale, became a system that's releasing carbon rather than sequestering carbon. So let's move now on to the spatial information starting at the very top of the Greater Everglades with Water Conservation Area 1, which is also known as the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. And this might be the most pristine part of the Everglades. Of course, maybe the people at the park would argue differently. They might say they're the most pristine, but for this type of habitat, is very different from Area 2 and Area 3. It has a lot of tree islands. It has really healthy vegetation, and the Loxahatchee Refuge has two types of tree islands. It has a fixed or pedestal type of tree island that is sitting up high on a rock pedestal, and you have these pop-up systems as well. And these pop-ups are unique to Loxahatchee because it is a deeper environment than the rest of the system. It used to be more of a lake type environment historically, and we are trying to keep it at higher water levels. And when you have these higher water levels, what happens is the marsh will pump gas down into the roots, and sometimes they actually pop up during high water and float over onto a ridge or onto a marsh and get significantly elevated when the water levels drop and become a place for tree islands to develop. It's important to focus on tree islands for a little while because they are the most diverse habitat in the entire Everglades. As you see here, there's about 290 different major animals that are living on tree islands. But these islands are also rookery habitats, they're wildlife refuge during high water, they're breeding and nesting grounds for a variety of animals. They're archaeological resource. They're also a Native American resource for ritual type of interactions. They're aesthetically pleasing. They have recreational value. And one of the things that I'll get into a little bit later is they might actually be responsible for keeping the phosphorus low in the Everglades. But things are not all peachy keen in the Loxahatchee Refuge, and that's because it is the major hotspot for Lygodium. And it is being totally covered, the tree islands are being totally covered by this wiry type of fern, and the stems are so wiry that when deer get caught in it, it's like a trap. They'll end up dying from dehydration. And just so you see the scale, there is a person right here compared to the size of the Lygodium. And then on this image, the Lygodium gets so heavy that the trees actually collapse onto themselves and becomes a giant open habitat. The other thing that's classical here, and you're going to find that almost everywhere in the Everglades, is a rim of cattails. Wherever we have canals, and we have a rim canal around the entire refuge, there's going to be cattails associated with it because of the input of nutrient-laden water. Area 2, on the other hand, is the place where we have the most cattails. Lygodium is the beast to take care of in Area 1. Area 2, the beast to try and take care of is this cattail community here. And it's been growing since 1991. We started mapping it in 1991 because the compartmentalization and a disregard for water quality kept increasing the aerial extent, and this type of infestation was destroying the ridge slough tree island habitat that was typical of the Everglades pattern. And we now know, of course, that cattails spread due to phosphorus inflows, But it's due to a biological difference between sawgrass or cladium and cattails typha. The parenchyma tissues of typha can pump a lot of oxygen down into the roots, and that's what you're seeing here with the extra blue dye indicative of oxygen values. And compared to the oxygen in the media that the caladium is grown in, it's significantly different. And so that spurs on this colonial behavior, and before you know it, your ridge slough system is gone. The thing that's interesting also is that cattails will spread due to phosphorus efflux as well. And that although there is no direct phosphorus input into the northern part of 3A like there was in 2A, we see almost the same amount of cattails sprouting up in the northern region, and this is due to the flood control era and the subsidence, the soil oxidation, the drainage era, creating mineralization of that peat and creating a rich habitat for cattails to grow despite the fact that there is no phosphorus input to here. And of course, like I said earlier, if you follow all these canals, there's plenty of cattails all along all the canals, over all the water conservation areas. But what we have noticed, we haven't been able to map it yet, but we think even internally within the system, as tree islands drown and disappear, the high phosphorus habitats are leading to cattails in the middle of the Everglades. And speaking of tree islands and phosphorus, this is showing us that the head of a tree island can be 2 orders or maybe 3 orders of magnitude greater total phosphorus in the soil than the surrounding marsh soil. We see that there's a gradient downstream to the tail of phosphorus. And if there is no phosphorus input from the canals to tree islands like this in the middle of the Everglades, the question becomes, how in the world do you get such high phosphorus concentrations? And there are a number of ways that it does it. And the one way that is probably most responsible for removing phosphorus from the surrounding environment is here in the below ground mobilization and the differential transpiration of the trees to pull water from the surrounding sloughs through the porous rock up into the trees. But it's also due to the fact that birds could be feeding in the surrounding marsh and coming to the rookeries and depositing guano. We think there's also a windborne particulates are captured by the trees and creating this high nutrient content of tree islands. But tree islands are one of the habitats that have been most significantly affected by the infrastructure created starting in the 1900s. And this image is showing you where the tree islands were. It's showing you kind of the directional pattern of flow. There's a couple of things to notice here in the 1940s, that there's hardly any tree islands left in the northern part of 3A because it got so dry there that they just burnt away. But there are some ridges left that got habitated by trees and shrubs. So these might be these are not typical tree islands here and here, but they are shrubby in 1940 according to the map analysis we did. And then when we overlay on top of it the 1995 imagery, what we see here in red are all the tree islands that have either completely disappeared or become ghost tree islands where just some small head is left. The yellow is showing here it would be no change. 65% of the tree islands in 3A have either burnt away, oxidized, and or flooded. Like I said earlier, you can oxidize and then water levels come up and you flood. 55% of the tree islands in Everglades National Park have also disappeared, mostly due to burnt away or oxidized, not flooded. And you'll see why that is in a minute. The pre-drainage ridge and slough tree island microtopography is a keystone characteristic of the Everglades. You cannot really function as an Everglades if you don't have this pattern of landscape, where you have tree islands for animals to nest on. You have ridges that funnel water into the sloughs, and of course you have the sloughs. And during the wet season, the whole system flows and delivers nutrients and food and moves the sediment around. And during the dry season, the wading birds and all the fish aggregate in the sloughs. One of the things that's rather unique about the Everglades is the flow direction, that unlike many other patterned wetlands throughout the world, these features are parallel to the flow, and in many other places these type of features actually are perpendicular to the flow. So the ridge slough tree island is a keystone characteristic of the Everglades, but if you had to pick a keystone of the keystone, it would be the sloughs. So let's dive into the sloughs for a minute and take a look at a number of characteristics that we see in this slough. And what you'll see in this video is the clarity of the water. You'll see lots of fish. What you see is periphyton along the benthic system, but also as sweaters along the water lily branches. What is remarkable about this type of environment is the lack of sediment. But when you stir up the system, like we did in this section, you see sediment not like you would see in the rest of the world. It's white particles. These white particles are actually the calcium carbonate periphyton community, and that is the flock. And of course, we have a bluegill, which is about to eat our camera here. So that's also one of the differences. It's not a deltaic system. It's biologically controlled, and elevation is controlled by the organic matter. And there's a dramatic loss of the ridge and slough landscape, and I want to show you this image because it demonstrates just how dramatic it is. And in 1940, the only thing that was in this ridge and slough habitat, and the green, by the way, would be the ridges, and the white would be the sloughs in this northwest part. The only thing there was the Miami Canal. These other levees were not there. And you'll see what happened as a result of drainage and flood control. So we preserved some areas above this area. Rotenberg and Holy Land are preserved by the Florida Wildlife Commission. But I want you to notice that the sloughs, there are no slough habitats here. There is no directionality. That this is very typical of what happens in a lot of the system due to the infrastructure changes. You have cattails along the canals. You have dense willows that come in because the system just is inundated with ponding, dense sawgrass, and then regular sawgrass. Down here, you might actually see some remnant of a slough community. I want to simulate the past and present ecohydrology for you because this might be one of the most important aspects of Everglades restoration. Let's follow a computer simulation along this L1 transect, which is this one through Computer World here, because it goes from the northwest part of 3A into Shark Slough. And what we'll do is in the next graphic, there'll be two places in the graphic that show the location of Alligator Alley, which of course is a road that goes west and east, and Tamiami Trail, which goes west and east, to give you a geographic reference. I think you'll understand once I show you the next picture. So here is the pre-drainage hydrology and going from northern 3A into Shark River Slough. Shark River Slough is down here. There's Tamiami Trail, and this whole other section is 3A. And what we're seeing is monthly water level changes using our meteorologic period of record. And the key thing that you need to notice is just how parallel to the sediment surface all the changes in water level are, going from a wet season to a dry season. Let's see, we're March, April, but it's really not showing any part of the system drying out at all. It's showing a range of about 2 feet of water depth. Now, if we take the same type of analysis and we apply it to today's system, in today's system, what we've done in the green dots, we've put the tree island locations on either side of the L1 swatch. 2 miles on each side of that swatch is showing tree islands. And clearly, the difference is the northern part of 3A is drying out significantly. It continues to oxidize and burn and subside. And then we have this wedge effect that's when it hits Tamiami Trail, the tree islands in the southern part of 3A go underwater, and is a significant irritation, a minimum kind of irritation for the Miccosukee tribes, which use these tree islands for ritual events, and culture, and none of the tree islands are going underwater, which they need for hydration in Everglades National Park. And so we have a significant alteration in the hydrology, and all of that can be summarized in this next slide. When we compare pre-drainage to current in terms of water depths, we see that the wedge effect in the current system creates too deep in the south and too shallow in the north. We see that the seasonal rise and fall of water levels do not remain parallel in the current system. We know that the slough depth is significantly lower everywhere as a function of the infrastructure that we've built. We know that the slough hydrology contains water 99% of the time in the pre-drainage, but not so in the current system. And the sheet flow is even across the landscape, but not so currently. It's not aligned with the flow direction. And these values here at the bottom of the graph are showing you significant differences in discharge associated with pre-drainage and current. Now, I want to focus a little bit on the wading birds. These 4 species here are indicator species for SERP, and we are trying to restore the supercolonies that existed historically. If we go back to 1985, we see that the average nesting counts were only 8,000. And then there was a shift in water management, a shift in rainfall extent. That we went into a wetter period, and that produced almost 31,000 on average nests. And then a miracle happened. In 2018, 122,000 nests, equivalent to the type of super colonies that existed in the 1930s and 1940s. And it's important to realize the relationship between nests like this and the hydrology of the system. And here we're saying that the dry conditions during 2017 led to fewer predatory fish and as a result, increase the crayfish recruitment. Everyone likes to eat crayfish, and if you're from Louisiana, crawfish. But these little guys are very tasty. But if the predator is hit by an extreme drought, the predatory fishes are decreased. It leaves the young crayfish to grow to be eaten by the wading birds. So what we're seeing here in the image to the left is just how dry the park and Big Cypress and 3A got during the 2017 dry season. Notice also where these colonies were in relationship to where water levels were left, or where foraging was actually pretty good, which is the green. So what happened when the wet season came, the extreme rainfall and the consistent drying during the nesting season produced prey concentrations across the landscape just at the right time and place. And if we look for the green in this next sequence of images starting in October, you see that the system is drying out, and you can see the places where the wading birds are starting to forage. It is a sequence of very great optimum foraging depth. So now let's move into Everglades National Park. And there's basically 7 major environmental issues for the park: soil oxidation, tree island loss, invasive plants, invasive fauna, peat collapse, mangrove vulnerability, and seagrass die-off. Now, these 4 on the top list are prevalent throughout the Everglades, but the peat collapse, mangrove vulnerability, and seagrass die-off are rather unique to the Everglades system. So I'm going to talk about those 3 things right now. The first one is peat collapse. What we're seeing in the transition zone between mangroves and sawgrass, a reduction in the amount of peat surrounding the sawgrass culms. This image here on the right is about 2 feet of root mass that we're seeing that was probably not there 10 years ago. And we think that it's due to overstepping, where saltwater encroachment is too fast for all communities to retreat. And we're seeing that in many places. And one of the things that relates peat collapse to the infrastructure is the change in the net ecosystem production, which is here on the left, indicating a negative value is when carbon is released from the system. A positive value is when carbon is sequestered. And notice there's a blue line here for water depths. And when we don't have enough water in the system, the more salt, which is the gray bar here, the more salt there is in the system, the more carbon loss there is in the system. And when we look at the opposite time during the wet season, the more salt in this kind of peat collapse region, the less carbon sequestration there is at the same time. So this peat collapse is related to transgression. Mangroves are gradually migrating upslope with increases in sea level, but can they keep up is the question. Well, if we look at the southeast saline ecosystem, where we have the scrub mangroves migrating up, we can see to what extent by comparing this 1940 white zone, which is a scrub mangrove zone, compared to 1994, we see that 3.3 kilometers have migrated inland. But the question is, as they migrate inland, and this is a really great picture that Dr. Mike Ross took, showing these scrub mangroves migrating past a freshwater tree island, what you notice is that there's a lot of open marly type of soil surrounding these tree islands. And the question is, can this type of marine transgression deal with sea level rise? And we can look at different places in the system and figure out whether accretion rates are enough to maintain elevation. And what we see is by using the sediment elevation table and marker horizons here in mangroves, where we look at deposition on top of a marker horizon, and we use the set to establish elevation change, that in areas like the white zone, where there is no low flow, it's always inundated, there's little fresh water and little total phosphorus input, that since 1997, those type of environments have only been accreting 1.2 millimeters per year. I shouldn't say accreting, I should say elevation change. There's been a fair amount of deposition on top of greater than the actual elevation change, but it's not sticking around, it's decomposing, it's not being incorporated into the soil, because these scrub mangroves probably don't have a large root system. Now that's very different than a system where, if you look at Taylor Slough, where we have high flow, we have seasonal inundation with fresh water, we have an elevation change of 4.4 millimeters, and looking at these pictures, the mangroves are a lot denser. There's not as much open water. There's also a lot of deposition of dead material, and this graph here is showing that the accretion is not as great as elevation, and this difference you see here is due to below ground root production. And finally, we go to Florida Bay. Florida Bay, at the very southern part of Everglades National Park, is made up of 27 separate basins. It may be the most complicated estuary in North America. It has major seagrass beds, turtle grass, manatee grass, and shoal grass. Most of that grass can be found in the central and west part of Florida Bay. And the issue here in Florida Bay is, of course, seagrass die-off. And in 2015, the seagrass die-off created a large political concern, an economic concern, an ecological concern. And you could see the image here on the bottom right is what Johnson Key Basin looked like after the die-off, and the video on the top is showing someone pulling on the thalassia grass, and the roots not coming up with it because the meristem has become dead and probably toxified, if that's a word, by the hydrogen sulfide that's associated with these die-offs. And I want to focus on the process of die-off, which I'll do in a minute. I just wanted to document for a minute with you how this happened. If you actually look at the water year, the salinity values compared to the average and the standard deviation, what we see is that the seagrass die-off occurred during maximum salinity. But it doesn't take high salinity alone to cause seagrass die-off. And in this diagram of the cascading impacts of seagrass die-off, the thing to notice is first you need thick seagrass beds, and then combined with low rainfall, low flow, high salinity, and high temperatures, boom, seagrass die-off. And that's what happened in the 2015 die-off. But what also happened is the fact that this dead decomposing seagrass lowered the oxygen and increased the toxic concentrations of sulfide. So that caused even more seagrass die-off. And so there's now a cycle going around the system until something else happens, and that is the release of nutrients and an algae bloom. So now what you have is the algae is cutting down on the transparency of the water. The seagrass beds that remain can no longer see the radiation that they need, and sulfide continues to build up, and this cycle just continues for a relatively long time. And I want to show you just how long it can continue. So what we see here in this graph on the top is water year 17, 18, and 19, showing periods where Hurricane Irma and tropical storms Gordon and Michael came online. The bottom graph is your total phosphorus. And the chlorophyll and the total phosphorus concentrations continue to go beyond the mean and standard deviation of the period of record for both of them because of that cascading impact. But then in water year 17, it looks like in about October, we see a dramatic decline in chlorophyll associated with a decline in the phosphorus concentrations. We see chlorophyll extremely low. We see phosphorus concentrations at the lower extent of the phosphorus. But once Irma comes along, we see a resurgence of chlorophyll. We see a resurgence of the total phosphorus concentrations. And let me just put in some accent arrows here to bring the point home that if a hurricane comes along a couple of years after a seagrass die-off, you are still vulnerable to more seagrass die-off because there's a giant algae bloom happening, and you got a change from a benthic system to a pelagic system, and even tropical storms, when they come along, can have an impact. What you'll notice with the tropical storm, though, it's not as great a chlorophyll, not as great a phosphorus, and a quicker recovery time. The nutrients can also come from the death of mangroves upstream. This is an image from NASA showing a area in 10,000 islands before and after Hurricane Irma. When I push the button, what you'll see is a lot of dead mangroves. The leaves are gone, and all that organic matter with its embedded nutrients will leave the system and go into Florida Bay. So there's a long recovery time and a significant impact of natural phenomenon combined with changes and alterations to the hydrology of the system. A lot of information from many outstanding scientific studies were packed into this video. I might have made it confusing by incorporating some keystone ecological processes into this discussion. If so, at the bottom of this slide is my email address. Feel free to send me an email with your questions. Is there a take-home message nested within this video of ecological change in the Everglades? It was probably difficult to see, but there is one. The many phases of hydrologic alteration and their subsequent ecological consequences all pointed to the amazing resilience of the Everglades. Despite all the peat fires, of the drainage era, the loss of thousands of acres during the flood control era, the drowning of tree islands during the water conservation era, and the loss of the ridge and slough microtopography over the last 100 years, the Everglades is still an amazing place of beauty, wonder, and resilience. We see this resilience in the slow but eventual return of the seagrass beds in Florida Bay. We see it in the potential for the return of wading bird supercolonies. We see it in the water quality of the Everglades as thousands of acres of stormwater treatment come online. And we will continue to see it as we face the climate challenges that are upon us. A big thank you to all the Everglades scientists at the South Florida Water Management District, the SERP scientific community, and the district's communication department for making this video possible. Thank you for your attention.